And thank you, my Jewish Learning. This class has really become such a lovely, fun thing to do exactly once a month. Funnily enough, it's just perfect. And so nice to see some familiar faces and some new ones too. Really, really lovely to be with you all. Julie, please, can we put the link for the source sheet in the chat? This will be the sheet we'll go through. I'll also share my screen so that if that's easier for some folks, and you'll see it there too. I want to just say a brief word about our new month of Tevet. We just started, as before we even look at any of the sources, which is Hanukkah, the festival we're currently enjoying the tail end of. It's the only festival that spans 2 months, and often the emphasis when people learn about Hanukkah is Kislev. Kislev, month of dreams, month of fire. That's like a very natural fit for Hanukkah, but it's really interesting to note this strange phenomena of Hanukkah spanning the moon going away completely and then coming back, which actually means that Hanukkah spans the very darkest point of the entire year, because not only are we as close as possible to the winter solstice in terms of the sun, and close as possible as the Hebrew calendar allows, but also we're at the point where the moon goes away completely as it then comes back. So the nights of Hanukkah are truly the darkest of the entire year. And then right now, for the last 2 days of the festival, we wake up and we find ourselves in the festival still, right? Still in celebratory mode, and we have the traditional practice of lighting the candles and bringing more light to the world. But we're no longer in Kislev, which has all these positive associations. And instead, weirdly, and this is what we're going to be dealing with in this class, we're in a month with a lot of really difficult associations. Some of you may know, you may not. It's okay, either way. There's a fast in this month. The 10th of Tevet is a very sad day. It's one of the traditional fasts, which is associated with the process that eventually led to the destruction of our temples. It's the date when the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, besieged Jerusalem on his way to then shortly after destroying the first temple. And actually, there's a lot of other sources and literature connecting a month with other tragic things that happened too. So there was the siege of Jerusalem. Also, this is interesting because it's related to Hanukkah. Also in our month, shortly before the 10th, on the 8th of Tevet, the Torah was translated into Greek. And this is a whole fascinating thing. We could do a whole class on it. We're not going to. I'll just say a few words about it because it relates to Hanukkah. So interestingly, Hanukkah is all about our victory over the Greeks. And ultimately, it wasn't actually a long-lasting, permanent victory. The victory that we celebrate on Hanukkah in terms of the military victory was actually relatively short-lived. We did succeed in kicking out our imperial overlords and reclaiming the temple briefly, but then basically what happened was the Hasmonean dynasty, the Jews who were then in charge, were fairly soon corrupted and fell into fighting among themselves, internecine conflict, and basically a civil war fairly soon. And then what happened is one of the sides in the civil war invited the Romans to come and help them. And that is actually how the Romans first became present in the land of Israel and got a foothold in the land of Israel. And if you know the end of the story, the Romans, not that long later, were in charge and destroyed the second temple. So Hanukkah, we celebrate the victory and we celebrate the miracle, and there's much love and light. But actually, it's very interesting. It's really a notch, a mark on the way to something that isn't so permanent and wonderful in the end. So it feels kind of anticlimactic. And I think that also relates to where it's at to in the calendar. I can't really think of any other examples where we have this beautiful, uplifting festival where, we're very much emphasizing the positive, but then it actually kind of directs us into something so challenging in the same way. But it's not coincidental. It's all very connected, because that victory over the Greeks that was only temporary, which we celebrate, the temporariness was actually only on the surface. The deeper victory of the flames and the miracle and the spiritual victory, we read on Hanukkah, the reading from the prophet that says, "Not by might, not by strength, but by spirit alone," says the Lord. So that's really like one of the key messages of Hanukkah. So the spiritual victory endures regardless. So yes, the temple was destroyed, but there's something from Hanukkah that we hopefully have all been privileged to experience a little of, which is that light and that hope and that optimism, that connection, that goodness that you get from lighting those candles at this time. And hopefully, maybe not this year, but hopefully normally that being an opportunity for connection with others as well, that brings tremendous strength. And I really think, looking back at Jewish history, whether you think of this spiritually or just purely in very kind of pragmatic terms, I really think that gave people a tremendous amount of strength to keep going through a lot of very dark, long, cold winters in some very inhospitable corners of the world. So that victory of Hanukkah actually proved to be very long lasting, very enduring. And as we can learn about in this class, the work of Hanukkah leads us to where we are now, which is the month of Tevet. And as we're going to find out, has some very particular challenges for us. And I'm just going to check the chat. See, we're good? No, we're good. Great. So let's dive into the sources and we'll see what the particular challenge is. So I'm going to share my screen with you. One sec. Okay, here we go. So first source, as we often look at, a piece from Sefer Yetzirah. It's our oldest work of Jewish mysticism. Actually, in case it's interesting for anyone, speaking of book lists, Rabbi Jill Hammer just put out a new book. It's a part translation of Sefer Yetzirah and part workbook around it too. And by all accounts, looks very wonderful. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but it's great to have like another possible translation out there, another book about it for anyone who's interested. So Sefer Yetzirah, very old mystical work, and it tells us a few of the key characteristics of every month in our calendar, among many other things, some of which are pretty hard to understand because they're somewhere between mysticism and magic, basically. Here we have the section about our month of Tevet. It says in Sefer Yetzirah 5:10, he here is God, he made the letter Ayin, king over anger, and he bound a crown to it. And he combined one with another, and with them he formed Capricorn in the universe, Tevet in the year, and the liver in the soul, male and female. So every month has a letter, a constellation, a part of the body, and a character trait or a faculty or something that people do, which we're invited to focus on in this month. So we have the letter Ayin, that's the letter of our month. We have the constellation of Capricorn, and we have the liver being the part of the body. And what we're going to focus on in this class is anger, roges. And it's interesting because anger in Hebrew is usually very often kas, kaf, ayin, samach, but here it's roges, which actually really has connotations of rage or fury, of very deep and raging anger. So that is the thing we're asked to pay attention to in our month. I mean, that's exactly what we're going to do in this class. And just bear in mind the context I said at the beginning about how we're going from this tremendous light and celebration, which we're still enjoying now, where we're going into a time that's challenging and dark. Maybe I'll just say one other thing about that now, what I think about it, which is, if we think about where we are in the calendar, just come back to you all here, just in terms of like what the sun is doing, just in terms of the fact that like we just had the solstice. So the sun, well, actually we're about to have the solstice, but Hanukkah is always the closest we can to it. So like the sun is going away, and Hanukkah, adding the candles of Hanukkah, lighting one more candle each night, represents the sun coming back. We have a beautiful passage in the Talmud that makes that connection for us. So we light the lights of Hanukkah to say, hey, don't worry, the sun goes away, but the sun also comes back. So great, the sun's come back, and that means the days are going to start getting longer again. But here's the thing: I'm sure it's not just me who experienced this growing up in England. I'm sure many of you, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere anyway, you also had a similar experience at some point in your life. It happens very slowly. Like January in London is not suddenly like light again. In fact, to be honest, January, February, March in London is not suddenly nice and light again. Like it's a very long, slow grind till you actually start feeling the light really coming back, and it actually is getting warmer and nicer, right? Now, here in the land of Israel, where I'm blessed to be right now, you feel it by like mid-February normally. Like I know it's you're okay by Shabbat, really, we're getting there, but still, like it's not instantaneous, right? And this is like a pretty deep representation of a lot of turning points in our own life. Like we turn a certain corner, we do a certain amount of spiritual work, and sometimes we really, really want and hope and need the results to be instantaneous. And the reason why Tevet, I think, is a test, and why anger is the quality of Tevet, and why we need to work with Tevet in this month, is because the results are often not instantaneous. The results are often frustratingly delayed, and we have to learn how to navigate the long dark night of the soul, or the long cold winter before we get to the spring, right? So that's really what I think we're doing here in Tevet, looking at anger in terms of the calendar. So let's come back to the sheet and see some beautiful sources about that. See that work? That works. Great. Okay, so Proverbs 16:32. It's better to be slow to anger than mighty, to have self-control than to conquer a city. So beautiful source, which is actually very typical of our tradition in terms of saying, exterior strength is very nice, just like that passage I just mentioned before from the prophet about, not by might, not by strength, but by spirit, right? So in the same way, it's very nice to have an army that can conquer a city, but actually, who is mighty? The rabbis also say in the Ethics of the Fathers, someone who can master themselves, who can master their own inclination, their own desire, koveshet yitzro, who can conquer their own desire. So this is the origin of that idea in Scripture. And let's see a few things that the Talmud says about anger. Says, this is from Reuven 65b, the next source. Rabbi Eli says, with three things a person can be discerned: in his cup, his anger, and his wallet. And some even say in his recreation. So Rabbi Eli is saying, this is how you can know a person. Nikar. This is how you can know who a person is and what their character is. Their cup means their relationship with drinking, specifically alcohol, right? Is this person, does he have an addictive personality, right? And how is he with this thing? And by the way, in Talmudic times, they drank wine literally like we drink water. It was often the only safe and freely available thing that they could drink, because the water wasn't always safe and freely available. So you couldn't really avoid it. You couldn't really be, out of that competition or conversation. So it was interesting to see, what people's relationship to that was. Their relationship to alcohol, anger, their wallet, their relationship with money and spending and so on. And some also say in our recreation. So anger is actually a key way that life holds a mirror up to us, and that others know us, and of course that we know ourselves. So often we might think that we're doing okay or not okay, or however we're doing, and something happens that triggers a certain response in us, and then we see, oh, like I thought I was XYZ, but actually, wow, I really kept my cool. That was great. I dealt with that really well. Or I really lost my temper completely, and it's a way of finding out what's really going on inside when it all comes out. Let's see a little bit more, and then we'll come back together. I'd love to hear some responses from some of you about this. So if you have any questions or reflections, please either put them on the chat now or just save them, and we'll come back together for them. So the Talmud and Shabbat 105b, bottom of the page. If someone tears their garment in their anger, breaks their utensils in their anger, or scatters their money in their anger, they should be regarded as an idolater, as that is the craft of the evil inclination. Today it tells them, do this. And the next day it tells them, do this, until it tells them, worship idols, and they go and worship. So pretty profound teaching, actually, because, you might think, okay, so I lose my temper sometimes. I'm a human being. I'm allowed to use my temper sometimes. It's just like, that's how some people are. And, it depends on who you are, and like maybe also the people you grew up with, how normal you think that is. If you're habituated to that as being like part of the way you are and part of the way people are in general, maybe you are, maybe you're not. But actually the Talmud wants to say here, if we lose control, essentially give up control to losing our temper, it's actually not okay. Like being an idolater is basically the worst thing that the rabbis can possibly say about someone. That's a cardinal sin, as we say. That's actually one of the things we're meant to lay down our life rather than do. Depending on the context, but it's bad. So they're saying, if you are willing to give up your freedom to lose your temper and do something destructive in that way, naturally you're potentially going to be willing to make the wrong choice and keep making the wrong choices until eventually you end up doing something which they think is just the worst thing you can do, to worship idols. So they're very suspicious of someone who does that. Now, of course, like I said, we're all human beings and we all do that sometimes. Like, it's not like they don't expect that you never lose your temper. But I think they're talking about somebody who, this is not just like once upon a time. This is something characteristic of a person, and B, the consequences of this. I think we all know the difference between feeling angry and regularly acting out on it in a destructive way. I think that's an important part of this teaching too. Let's look at one more thing together, and let's come back together. I'd love to hear some thoughts from you all. Over the page from the Talmud in Pesachim, Reish Lakish said, any person who becomes angry, if he is a Torah scholar, his wisdom departs from him, and if he is a prophet, his prophecy departs from him. Very, very strong statement. Don't care how wise you are. I don't even care. Being a prophet means you have a direct relationship with God, whatever that means, having a very high state of consciousness to receive God's message to you. I don't care, says Reish Lakish. If you become angry, that is not going to happen. Actually, I said one more, but this next source actually expands that's teaching. Let's look at one more, and then I promise we'll come back together. So this is from Rashi, our great French medieval commentator. His commentary on the Torah here, on the book of Numbers. He applies what we just learned to Moses. He says, since Moses came to a state of anger, he came to err, to make a mistake, for the laws of purging Gentile vessels eluded him. A similar incident happened on the 8th day of the installment of the priests, talking about setting up the tabernacle, the Mishkan, the portable temple that was used in the wilderness. So on the 8th day of that process of initiating the priests to work in the portable temple in the Mishkan, it says Moses became angry with Eleazar and Itamar, and he came to a state of anger. So he came to err. Similarly, in the episode of Now Listen, You Rebels, in Numbers 20, Moses hit the rock. A famous thing. This is the sin that Moses does, which means that in the end, he's not allowed to enter the land of Israel. As Rashi says, through anger, he came to err. So we have this principle from the Talmud that if you are a great scholar or you're a prophet, you lose your wisdom and you lose your prophecy if you get angry. And here, Rashi is telling us, and this is based, you see the small text in brackets, based on Sifrei Matot. I mean, that's a midrash, an ancient rabbinic midrash. So Rashi is usually basing what he's saying on the ancient rabbis. So here the ancient rabbis and Rashi are saying, even Moses, right, he went up to heaven and got the Torah for us and took us out of Egypt, etc., our greatest prophet, our greatest leader, even Moses got angry sometimes. And when he did, it didn't go well. He got things wrong. He got things wrong about the Torah, and he reacted in the wrong way and said the wrong things, and so on. Okay, let's come back together. I'd just love to hear if anyone has any comments or insights about any of that, or any questions too. We'll be happy to address. Let's see. So let's begin with, okay. Aura asked about letter ayin specifically associated with anger. I really hadn't actually thought about that before. But it might be, or something comes to mind, which is, kind of similar to what I was saying about Tevet being a test of patience. The letter ayin essentially is a almost silent letter. It's like it was originally enunciated as a kind of like, oh, yeah, and it might also be a kind of relationship there with the frustration of not completing a full sound. And not like fully articulating something. So and like what we do with that, like if we face our frustration, like if we respond in anger or not, that would be one way I think about it. Karen asked, what about tearing one's clothes when someone close to our side? Great question, Karen. I'm so glad you asked about that. So some of you may know this practice. God forbid someone passes away, and then traditional practices, like Karen says, for the close mourners, or actually anybody who witnesses the death, also to tear their clothes. So it's very, very interesting that because the Torah specifically says, do not gash yourselves, do not harm yourselves when somebody dies. Don't go over the top with your grieving to the point that you harm yourself. So actually, and the Torah also says, don't waste property. Like don't damage anything which could possibly be used constructively for no good reason. That's actually something the rabbis derive from the Torah, but it's a very important principle. Bal tashchit, it's called. Like, don't waste any food or anything else that could be useful. So the laws about tearing your clothes in mourning are actually very circumscribed. For example, if you tear your clothes too much, well, in this situation, God forbid it happens, but if somebody tears their clothes too much, that's actually considered a sin. It's like if you basically you've like ruined the clothes more than necessary. And this is fascinating. I really didn't expect to find this, but this is true. This is the law. This is the halacha. Except for the exception of if somebody, God forbid, is doing this for their parents. Apart from that example, we can actually fix clothes which we tear in this way. So someone tears their clothes in mourning, they're actually, it's fine to fix them after the period of mourning is over and go out wearing them after. So just a fascinating limitation there on these things, which I think really speaks to Karen's question of, we're not supposed to get carried away in anger when we perform this act of mourning. That's not what it's about. Charlie says, I wonder what they would think of people who have PTSD and get easily angered. Right. Thank you, Charlie, for that. So, the rabbis are really giving advice for good character. Obviously, people who have specific challenges need to be, everyone needs their own path, and everyone needs their own therapeutic path and to be dealt with where they are in their own way. The rabbis are giving general good guidelines for what to aim for, though. I think your question is a very fair one. Avril says, the 3 incidents of Moses becoming angry are why he was not allowed to enter Eretz Israel. Exactly. Yeah, thank you, Avril. Thank you for mentioning that. That's something we covered a little bit. Nan says, please resend the link. Okay, please do. Thank you, Julie. Celeste says, wonderful to have the Munster Fine explained. You're so welcome. Let's see. Ayin means eye in Hebrew, says Ellen. So how you look at something with a good eye or a bad eye. Ellen, that's right on. Yes, I really like that. Actually, this is a teaching I was going to bring at some point, so I think now is the right time. We don't have time to look at this whole teaching in the original text, but I think it's a really important teaching for dealing with anger, and it relates directly to what Ellen was saying. So Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, some of you may have heard of, famous Hasidic master. One of his most celebrated teachings is all about the way we look at things really affects them. And this is something we now actually see from quantum and uncertainty that physics it really affirms, which is very interesting. It's completely post-Newtonian. It's completely a recent phenomenon that science is affirming this, but the way we look at things actually does change them. And Rabbi Nachman says, if we look at someone, including ourselves, and try and see the good in them, that actually changes how that person is. Not just how we see them and how we feel about them, but actually the reality of how that person is. And so, just like Ellen's saying here, that ayin really can be part of the work of dealing with anger. Ayin in the sense of the eye can really relate there. So thank you for that, Ellen. Elizabeth says, to walk in his ways, according to the Rambam, means literally to conquer the trait of anger. We'll get there, Elizabeth. We will see Maimonides shortly. We'll see what he says for ourselves. But yes, don't ruin the surprise for spoiler alert. Let's see. Vida says, Adonai expresses anger frequently throughout the Torah. Yes, thank you for that, Vida. This is really, really an interesting realm of exploration. We're not going to have time to have the full discussion about it, but really important to acknowledge. God gets angry. God in the Torah, it happens. And it's just fascinating. Now, the way I like to deal with this, way I like to see this issue is, all of the things that God does in the Torah are like near the beginning of God's life and our relationship with God. And really, we see the God that we are ready for. And we see as the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible develops, when we go through the books of the prophets and then the writings, we really see God does, frankly, grow up. God becomes less and less angry and vengeful and destructive, and more focused on helping the poor and the orphan and the needy and social justice and more universalist and so on. And then we see the rabbis take that baton from the scriptures, from the Tanakh, from the Hebrew Bible, and they really run with it. They really go in the direction of turning God more and more into a caring God. So I think, it says a lot about the primal origins of, our ancient civilization, our ancient religion, and also, not to minimize it. It is part of the human experience, right? It's not. I'm not saying, like, God forbid, like, and these days none of us get angry because we all know better, but just like we maybe aim a little bit higher ultimately for how we're going to behave. And even those teachings we just saw about Moses, I think, are suggesting that, like, Moses was getting angry, but it's the rabbis who are looking back and saying, no, Moses, like, you are a role model for us, and we need better than that. Like, you let us down for that, right? And that's not the ideal that we're aiming for. Even if we're never going to get to the ideal, we still need an ideal that is, representing our values. Jonathan says, what does Sefer Yetzirah mean? And the liver in the soul and the female. So what it means, Jonathan, is that there's a principle in Kabbalah that the human body is a microcosm of the universe, and that applies in both space and time. So every single part of your body and my body and everyone's body is represented in the universe, and in spiritual terms too. Like, my left pinky is actually, like, a representation of something spiritual and infinite and cosmic, and that also applies in time. So my left pinky is also representative of a certain moment or a certain time. So the Sefer Yetzirah is mapping space and time and the different parts of the human body, which are also parts of our spiritual being. It's a bit of a longer conversation, but I hope that's like a helpful intro. I see you nodding, so hopefully it is. Great. From Cheryl, is there a definition of anger in the sources? Perhaps it is more about the expression of anger. Brilliant, Cheryl. Yes, we're going to talk about this. Is really good. Right, there's nothing wrong with feeling angry, right? Nothing wrong with it arising, but what do you do with it? That's the question. Recognizing the power of anger and the importance of not becoming destructive internally and to others or to the environment. Unexpressed anger can do tremendous harm. Brilliant, Cheryl. Absolutely, completely agree. And we have lots of things on the sheet. Hopefully we'll see some of them which really agree with that. I see now I invited you guys to comment. You have loads of great things to say. It's fine. But we'll be here as long as we're here. Eliora says, is there actually a resource sheet for tonight? Oh, yes, there is. So hopefully that can be shared again. Raymond says, thinking of Hatikva, our eyes turn to Zion, eyes in hope. So that's the other side of ayin, right? So we talked about looking at things and trying to see the good in them. Brilliant. Thank you for that, Raymond. Melody says, isn't there a place for righteous anger when we see wrongs being perpetuated? Yes, definitely. Yeah, and Melody, I think part of I'm glad you're raising that question. That really goes with that other question also about expressing anger. Like, how do we know the right moment and the right way, and what's skillful and what's constructive there? Like, how do we know when it is healthy and how to express it healthily? So I think that's something hopefully we'll come back to as well. Steve, about the months, wouldn't it be simpler to just go back to how referring to the numbers, how they were? So Steve, that is a little off topic, so I'm not going to answer that now. Bigger conversation, but feel free to email me about it. My email's on the sheet. Be very happy to talk to you about that. I'm geeky for the calendar in case you hadn't noticed. Nan, isn't anger and injustice or harm to others often positive? Right, exactly, Nan. That's the same question again. We need to talk about that constructive anger and expressing it constructively. And Cheryl says, in Chinese medicine, looks at the liver as the place of emotions of anger, frustration, bitterness, irritability. The liver regulates the flow of energy in the body. Yes. So sometimes the places in the body that Sefer Yetzirah mentions really fit well with what we know from other modalities like Chinese medicine about those places in the body. And this is one of them. Thank you for mentioning that, Cheryl. Very much appreciate that. Brilliant. Okay. Thank you, everyone. That was really incredible. We have some great questions which you guys provided for us to kind of keep our attention on as we go forward. What is healthy anger? What is unhealthy anger? How can we express it healthily? Everyone feels it, but what do we do with it? And so on. Keep the questions coming. Keep the thoughts coming. Well, let's go back to the sheet and see what's next. We have a few real gems here. Shulchan Aruch, Code of Jewish Law. So we talked about how anger was going to ruin someone's wisdom and their prophecy. And in that spirit, here we learn something that maybe applies more to some of our regular religious practice. It says one should not stand to pray until they are in a state of deep awe and surrender. One should not rise to pray in a state of frivolity, immersion in idle matters, or mundane speech, and not in a state of anger, but rather in a state of joy. So ideally, prayer happens with this deep awe and surrender. I mean, the Code of Jewish Law is holding a high bar and saying, this is how it should be done. But actually, it kind of it builds in some caveats later and says, these days we're not such a great spiritual level that we can always have this, ideal state. So, do the best you can, but this is the ideal. But don't pray in frivolity, immersion in idle matters, or mundane speech. I imagine many of you, if you ever tried Jewish prayer, know the challenges of those things and, of leaving those things aside to try and focus on prayer, and not in a state of anger, but rather in a state of joy. So this is just fascinating, because if you're angry, let me come back to you all here for a minute and just think about this with you all. If you're angry, and it happens to be time to pray, because your community's praying, or, it's as if maybe you have a regular Jewish prayer practice and it's like, the time of day when you do that. Just knowing that you're not supposed to be angry, right? Like, oh, it's time to pray. I can't be angry anymore. I'm supposed to be joyful, right? Just knowing that is unlikely to do it, right? It's unlikely that that's going to make it, super easy to just, magically change your state. But this is what to aim for, right? We're being, advised what to try and cultivate, what to try and direct ourselves to. If we build our lives in such a way, build into our lives reminders and habits and routines and practices that make it more likely that more of the time we'll be able to find our way to being open to some joy, and less likely to be losing our temper, then we're going to have a better prayer practice. That's what we're being asked. Let me check the chat to see a few things here. We light a candle, not a fire. We respond. We try not to react. Beautiful, Ellen. I really love that. That's really beautiful. A difference between responding and reacting, and a candle and fire. It's great. Karen says, thoughts and feelings are automatic, but we control or have a choice over our behavior. Beautiful. So yeah, exactly, Karen. We don't control what arises, but what we do with it. Barry says, perhaps the process of engaging in prayer brings us into a more mindful state where we can let our anger go. Yes, right, Barry, I'm really glad you said that. I completely agree with that. And I want to name the challenge, which is, if I'm in a state of anger, then it's very hard to get into that prayer, right? It's very hard, prayer, we could, talk for a long time about what prayer is for different people, but I'm going to only talk from my own experience. Prayer involves an openness, right? An openness to receiving whatever I need to receive from wherever it comes, and an openness to being aware and connected, firstly to myself, right? Before anything else, I have to really be able to be present with myself, so that I can then be in relationship with whatever is outside of me. So often anger really cuts us off from that, right? Often anger fills our field. Anger, fills our senses with one very specific thing, and actually it cuts us off. And you can't see because of the screen, but I'm kind of like putting my hand here, like I feel like anger draws a line in us here. It cuts us off from a lot of what's going on in us, right? We just feel this one thing very strongly, and we often don't feel all the other stuff going on. And therefore, it's very hard to, as you say, be in that mindful state. It's very hard to enter into that if we're really consumed by anger. But you're right. Ideally, that's what the work of prayer is. That's what we're going for. Nan says prayer can lead to that state of joy. Yes, definitely. And that is, the ideal kind of prayer for a lot of the time. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. That's what we're going for. Cheryl says, if we can pray about our anger, we may experience transformation of it. I love that, Cheryl. So let me take that and run with it. To pray about my anger involves, again, just talking from my own experience, but I hope it's helpful. To pray on my anger, to pray about my anger, I have to be willing to not be completely consumed by it. I have to be able to hold it, right? Not to run away from it, not to deny it. Have to be able to recognize it and be like, oh yeah, okay, this is what I'm feeling, But I need, and this is something that we learn in meditation, I need to have a little piece of me that is not completely swallowed up in it, that can look at it a little bit from the outside and be like, okay, I'm holding you. It's okay. This is what's going on, and it's okay, right? So maybe this is a really important thing to go into a little bit more. Generally, with challenging emotions and anything that arises, thoughts too, this is often like a big game changer. Do I identify with it completely, let it completely take me over, right? Do I say, this is how I feel, and therefore I'm going to go out, God forbid, and do some destructive thing because that's the truth of my being right now? Or do I say, like, okay, this too will pass. Everyone experiences this. This is the human condition. This is what's coming up in me right now. I love the language that Buddhists use around this. Buddhists say, conditions are present for anger. It's so blissful. It's like they just create a beautiful distance there, right? It's just like, conditions are present. This is why it's happening. It's not like I am Mr. Angry from the Mr. Men series, right? It's like I am not the God of wrath, right? It's just like conditions are present. This is when the right conditions are present, then of course I'm going to get angry. So that's the teaching, which I really appreciate you guys naming so well. Let's see. Deanne said, no, Carolyn says, sometimes we find ourselves getting angry in a split second. I get upset because my dog messed on the carpet. I can imagine. I did not hurt him, but I raised my voice and was angry for a moment. I obviously knew it was not his fault. How do we learn to control ourselves so that these types of moments do not ever happen? Beautiful. I mean, Carolyn, all I can say is it's about the awareness, right? The fact that you're asking that question, the fact that you're noticing it's happening, I really feel is like 51% of the journey to changing the behavior, right? Because if we can see it clearly, then we have more choice over it than we used to, right? It used to just happen, right? It used to just be habit. I'm not saying just for you, but generally for most of us, if we can really see that moment of choice, then we can choose what to do with it. Eliora says, this is so much spot on. As just today, I've been in company Zoom meeting when one of the male participants started to explode with anger. Now this has been a rather distressing experience for everyone, but it seems he has no comprehension of himself of doing anything wrong. Wow. Eliora, I'm sorry you had that unpleasant experience. And yeah, maybe you should buy him a book about Tevet and anger. That sounds really challenging though. Yeah, it's not nice dealing with that. Let's go back to the sources and keep the discussion going based on these. This is wonderful stuff you guys are giving. So I promise we get to Maimonides. Someone mentioned him before. This is what he says about anger in his Hilchot Deot, literally the laws of human character traits or dispositions. He says the good way is the middle path in each and every tendency. So this is something that Maimonides Rambam learns from Aristotle, the golden mean, the middle way, always being the right way. And yet, there are certain tendencies which a person is forbidden to follow in the middle way, but must distance themselves from extreme to extreme. It's completely, absolutely. So just like, I'm really sorry, I don't remember who it was who said on the chat, they rightly said, Maimonides says that we have to completely cut ourselves off from anger. And again, this is really interesting for us in terms of this question of, well, obviously everyone feels anger. So, maybe it's about, the acting it out in a destructive way we're talking about, as we've been saying. So everything that we should follow the middle path for absolutely everything, except it sounds like, so far this is the only exception actually. Actually, no, that's not true. He gives a couple of other exceptions, but very few. Anger is one of the very few exceptions. Anger, there's no middle way, he's saying. Anger, we have to just completely go to the extreme against it. He says, it is proper for a person to remove himself from it to the other extreme. One should teach themselves not to get angry, even over a matter which calls for anger. So even if something really is objectively, okay to be angry about, whatever the criteria is that you decide that's true for, then actually he's still saying you shouldn't act out in an angry, destructive way. Carrying on, if one desires to bring awe on their children and their household or in the public, if they are the head of a community, even if they desire to get angry at them in order that they return to the good way, they should only act angry, like pretend to be angry in their presence so as to discipline them, but their consciousness should remain calm within them, even as a person imitates who is angry when the time calls for anger, but they are not really angry. So interestingly, this is what he is claiming actually that Moses was doing with the moment of the golden calf. When Moses throws the tablets down, Moses comes down with the two tablets, he sees the people built a golden calf, and he throws the tablets down. It certainly sounds like from the story that Moses is angry. And Maimonides has a certain image of Moses, which is very, very, very central to his whole view of Torah and the tradition and everything. And he cannot tolerate the idea that actually Moses is the kind of person that gets angry a lot of times, unlike some of the other sources we saw, which lists the number of times he does. So he says, no, that Moses, at least in that moment, wasn't actually really getting angry. He was actually just pretending to teach the people. I mean, we can do whatever we want with that reading. You can read the story how you want, but just so you know that that's how Maimonides felt he needed to do that. Let's go back to the sheet. Carrying on, we have a beautiful Hasidic teaching now from the Noam Elimelech, Rabbi Elimelech of Lezhensk, on anger, which I think has a beautiful pragmatism to it. And the Hasidic masters often have really beautiful appreciation for the way our minds and our beings really work. They really often give us advice that's very psychologically insightful. So he says, it's impossible for a person to break the qualities with which they were born from their mother's womb. Rather, they should raise them up to holiness. So that's like a general principle of Kabbalah and the Hasidic approach generally. Don't suppress, don't deny. Rather, take whatever's going on and try and elevate it. That's the general approach of the Hasidic movement. For example, he says, someone with the quality of anger should leave behind external angers and be angry with the wicked. So, okay, if you're the kind of person that gets angry, find things which are genuinely wicked, people and things that are genuinely weird, and vent at them, right? Let them have your anger. And so for all human qualities, and place them beside the altar, meaning bring them to holiness. Now, that's step one of two. I just want to point out that is limited. And I personally know, maybe some of you do too, that people who vent angrily at things, even if the things they're venting angrily at are genuinely bad, it still isn't nice to be around people who are doing that all the time. And the people who are doing that all the time are still suffering. They're still suffering the effects of anger. So I just want to name that. So that's step one. At least direct your anger at things which are worthy of your anger. But then here's step two. The verse that he's riffing off carries on from Leviticus chapter 6. He shall then take off his vestments and put on other vestments. This is all talking about what's going on in the tabernacle, the Mishkan, the portable temple, with the priest, the high priest, actually changing his clothing. So the high priest takes off one set of clothes and puts on another set of clothes, meaning, he goes, that afterwards they come to a greater level. So before, we took the anger and we took it to the altar, symbolizing we're directing it to the right place, meaning we're directing our anger to someone wicked. But now we're going to do something greater. What is it? We're taking off those clothes and putting on different ones, which means, he says, to strip themselves entirely of every hint of those qualities. And the verse carries on, and carry the ashes outside the camp to a clean place. This means, he explains, that those qualities they were born with will never return except in great holiness. So he began the teaching by saying, it's impossible to break the qualities you were born with, right? And then he gave us step one, which was, we'll learn to direct things as well as you can, right? But step two, ultimately, if you learn to direct things, and actually this goes back to what I was saying before about choice, that moment of choice, right? It's Viktor Frankl famously who says, between the stimulus and the response is everything, right? Between stimulus and response is our whole freedom as a human being, because it's up to us what we do with it. It's our choice. So if we notice that moment of choice and we choose to work with it, if we start by just using, maybe we only have enough freedom. It's like a boat or a vehicle traveling fast. Maybe at first we only have enough control to steer it, right? But eventually, if we can work out how to use the steering wheel, maybe we can also learn how to use the brakes, right? Maybe we can also learn how to actually change the whole energy of what's going on. Eventually, but he's acknowledging it's not a one-step process. It's a long process. Let me come back together to all here, see if anyone has any responses to any of this. Brilliant response. I like what Deanne said, words of encouragement to Carolyn. That's beautiful. Nan said, anger can be a spur to action to correct a wrong. Absolutely. Absolutely, we can channel it in the right way. So Nan, I actually want to affirm that and say, I think that that can be one way we understand that first step of the Noam Elimelech's path is like direct your anger in a constructive way, right? And that also applies to people who are talking about, anger can be righteous, anger can be just, anger can be used to make a good impression in the world. Absolutely. Bimia said, wow, that's beautiful, what a way to live. Thank you, beautiful. Steve says, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs said, the verdict of Judaism is simple. Either we defeat anger or anger will defeat us. Great quote from the great Rabbi Sachs, Zichron Livracha. His memory be a blessing. Richard Wolf says, is anger a manifestation of self-righteousness and judgment? So often it's connected to those things, Richard. Yes, definitely often connected to those things. Cheryl says, to me, anger is the symptom, the indicator that something deep is going on. Underneath it, fear, disconnection, violation, or threat of treasure values. Absolutely. Yeah, I really want to affirm that, Cheryl. Anger often is what we see. It's where we see those things manifesting. And then when we, for example, in meditation, if we explore those things, if we say, okay, I'm feeling all this anger, but, I'm just going to hold it. I'm just going to notice it. I'm going to acknowledge it and try and just sit with myself and see what's going on underneath. However long, it might take a long time to calm down to be able to do it. But when we can, very often we find those things that Cheryl mentions there in the fear, disconnection, threat, and so on. Very good. Ellen says, anger is a warning that a boundary has been breached. Yes, very, very beautifully put, Ellen. Very similar to Cheryl. And, the question is, what is that boundary? And what is our relationship to it? Often I find in my own work with anger, often I get angry because a boundary has been breached. I feel violated or threatened in some way, as Cheryl said. But often when I work with it, I find that what I thought should be a boundary actually doesn't necessarily have to be. Like, it was a boundary according to my story and my version of reality, which for whatever reason the other person didn't share. Now, sometimes maybe the other person is just wrong and did something very wrong and I should be angry. Fine, that happens sometimes. But sometimes I was walking around with my own imperfect view of reality, and the other person had their own subjective imperfect view of reality, and they didn't happen to match. But neither of us was especially wrong. We just, we were just both carrying our own assumptions which didn't match. So really interesting question there. What is that boundary that's been breached, and how attached are we to it? And is it serving us essentially? And the answer may be yes. It's a boundary that's very important, or it may be, oh yeah, it's a boundary that belongs to a certain story or a certain persona that actually we might be able to even go deeper than that. Let's do a little bit more from the sheet together. We have some advice from Rabbi Nachman, the great master I mentioned before, the great Hasidic master, on anger. He says a few really beautiful things there. He says, you must break the force of your anger with compassion, rachmanut. So that's one thing we haven't talked about directly. We had a lot of great suggestions and questions about how to deal with anger. He says, if you feel yourself becoming angry, make sure you do nothing cruel because of your anger. On the contrary, you must make a special effort to be kind to the very person you are angry with. Sweeten your anger with compassion. Now, of course, if God forbid someone really has done something very wrong to us, and they're just clearly objectively in the wrong, and we don't want to encourage that behavior or appease them or anything like that. But again, so many of our things which anger us, speaking for myself anyway, are less black and white than that, right? There's often a lot of gray, and there's often the possibility to see things from the other person's view if we can calm down enough and introduce enough compassion. And that's the invitation here. And if we can do that, radical suggestion, try being kind to them. And by the way, this might begin by just sending them good thoughts, by praying or meditating and intending good things to happen to them, which in itself can be huge for us, can be hugely transformative for us. I remember when, am I going to give this example? Yeah, I can give this example. Without saying anything about it myself, but when President Trump was elected, Jay Michelson some of you may know of, great writer and journalist and teacher and rabbi. He wrote a brilliant article saying why we should meditate and pray, sending positivity to President Trump. And he was speaking as, Jay Michaelson was speaking as somebody who did not feel positive towards President Trump at all. But he was saying, this is good for us to do this and can only help the situation. It will make us better, it will make him better, it will make the whole situation better. And it will also help us have a lot more clarity and honesty about what's really going on. Because when you try and wish somebody good things and do that, you get a lot more clarity about what's really stopping you doing that. Because you might think it's one thing, but actually when we do this work, we go deeper and we find out what it really is. Let's carry on with Rabbi Nachman a little bit longer. Anger and cruelty arise when a person's awareness, their dat in Kabbalah, their awareness or consciousness is limited. The deeper their awareness, the more their anger disappears, and compassion, kindness, and peace spread. This is why the study of Torah, which cultivates awareness, banishes anger and cultivates compassion and peace. So if you want to look up the reference, LM there is Likutei Moharan. It's Rabbi Nachman's masterpiece where he talks about that there. So I also want to say that it's as I said here, it's awareness. It's also connected to particularly awareness of our choice. We mentioned this before, like that moment of between the stimulus and the response of like, am I going to do this? I feel a certain way. Something has happened that's triggering me, we might say. Normally I respond like this, or in the past I've responded like this. I have a moment to just work on really choosing, do I want to do that in this moment? And the more we can build that muscle of choice, then he's saying, the more we can cultivate, as he says, compassion and kindness and peace, and the less anger. So it's all about that self-awareness and that choice. A couple more things from here. Anger damages one's livelihood, and through it one becomes distant from the truth and cannot pray, something we touched on. It also prevents one from completing or seeing through any task in the required manner. I won't spend time going into that. I'm sure you can all imagine why that might be. When a person breaks their anger, the spirit of Messiah is drawn into the world. Then it will be considered as if the world and all that was in it is created and brought into being through this person. They will be worthy of sustenance and to pray solely to Hashem without any ulterior motives, God forbid. And they will merit to fulfill all the mitzvot and other holy acts that they must accomplish. So the idea of Messiah may be very remote and distant to many of us, but for the Hasidic masters, one idea they represent is they actually say that we each have a piece of the Messiah inside us. And when we all work on ourselves, then our little piece of the Messiah is going to our piece of the puzzle is going to be there. So we're already doing our little bit that only we can do, our unique bit, to making the world the best world it can be. That's what he's saying we do when we break our anger. 12, through the sanctity of the land of Israel, it is possible to completely break the force of anger, depression, and laziness. Therefore, one needs to request forcefully from the blessed God to come quickly to the land of Israel. So I just left this in there to show this fascinating spiritual quality of the land of Israel that our tradition gives it, and especially, again, the Hasidic masters, that it's connected here in some way. You can take it however you want to. I can tell you that I live in Israel and I still get angry plenty. But it's interesting that there's this advantage for it. Let me just come back and see what people are writing on the chat. Let's see. Charlie says, what about anger in regard to the state of the world? A mix of anger and sadness. Can this have a rightful place? Beautiful, Charlie. So yeah, I absolutely, I want to honor that. One sec. I want to honor that. Feeling that way, which I'm sure many of us do. I think it's all about how we channel it. It's like, God forbid, somebody could feel that and they could channel it into destructive things, right? Into resenting people, or to, despair and giving up, and, God forbid, causing more harm, right? Because what's the point? Because, people are so bad, and, the world is so messed up and so on. But like, can I take that disappointment, and that may well include anger, and can I actually, if I go deep enough into it and I can hold it closely enough, tenderly enough, really with love and compassion, can I actually turn it to being a force to motivate me for doing good in the world? Can I say, if we go down into what you're talking about, Charlie, what I'm really hearing there is care. I'm really hearing a very deep care for the world, which I'm sure we all feel. I'm sure we all can relate to a feeling of disappointment with how various things are in the world. It's because we care. It's because we really, really care. And can we turn that to being a positive? I see we're almost running out of time, so I'll just see the last few comments on the chat. We might have to part company. Barry says, I have a website. Yes, I do. Julie just put on the chat. Thank you very much, Julie. That's it. Applied your spirituality. Ginger says, I learn all new skills. Thank you, everyone. You're so welcome. Nan says, compassion towards others over a long period of time can lead them to starting to meet you in a positive relationship rather than out of anger. Exactly. Beautifully put, Nan. Yeah, I really resonate with that. That's very much my experience and true. Ray says, anger can put you in a prison mentally, but joy and compassion brings freedom of mind. Beautiful. Yeah. As a famous example of that, Nelson Mandela said when he left prison after, 27 years, he said, I had the choice when I left prison if I was going to stay there or not, because I could have stayed there if I would have stayed resenting the people who put me there. And it was very powerful. So thank you for that, Raymond. And Emma says, I love the idea of the Messiah. I conceive of the Messiah as our collective ability and responsibility for evolving the world. Beautiful. You're so welcome. Thank you, Charlie. And Charlie says, I try to channel the anger for positive action and improving the world. I'm glad that there is space for this transformation of anger. Beautiful. Friends, I think we're out of time. I just want to say the last couple of sources on the sheet are, I think, very practical and helpful guidance for doing the practice. So if you have a couple minutes just to read the rest of the sheet in your own time, I encourage you to do so. As always, it's so lovely to learn from you and with you and to hear all your wonderful insights. So thank you very, very much. And thank you, Judy, and My Jewish Learning.